Today, we dive into a powerful story of two young black women who faced the cruel reality of racial discrimination. While enjoying a peaceful evening at a cafe, they were viciously taunted and insulted by a racist gang. But what happened next is a lesson that neither the gang nor the two women will ever forget. What truth lies beneath their encounter? Stay tuned with H2 Black Thread to discover the full story and the lessons learned. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest videos, because the truth deserves to be told. Let's begin. The soft hum of city life outside the cafe's windows was a stark contrast to the peaceful, cozy atmosphere that enveloped the small coffee shop inside. Mia and Lena had always found solace in this place. It wasn't just the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee or the gentle clink of teaspoons against ceramic mugs. It was the warm, inviting atmosphere that made it feel like a second home. Located on a quiet corner in the city center, the cafe had become their sanctuary after long, tiring days at work. Mia had a hectic job in the fast-paced world of finance, while Lena worked as a graphic designer. Both careers were demanding, but it was moments like these that reminded them there was still time to breathe, to unwind. The cafe had an eclectic charm, with mismatched chairs, soft jazz music in the background, and floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed the fading light of the evening to spill in, casting a golden hue over the entire space. As Mia and Lena settled into their usual corner booth, they couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The world outside was full of deadlines, meetings, and the relentless pursuit of success, but here, they could be themselves. The weight of their responsibilities seemed to melt away, replaced by the comforting warmth of the cafe and each other's company. Mia, always the more composed of the two, had her leather jacket draped over the back of her chair, her posture relaxed yet confident. She was the type of person who exuded a quiet strength, the kind that made people take notice without her having to say much. Her short, dark hair framed her face perfectly, and her eyes, sharp and observant, had a way of seeing everything while giving nothing away. Lena, on the other hand, was the softer of the two. Dressed in a simple white hoodie, she had a gentle smile that made people feel at ease. Her long, curly hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her eyes, though just as sharp as Mia's, held a warmth that could make anyone feel like they had known her for years. Her voice was calm and soothing like a lullaby, yet when she spoke, there was always a quiet strength beneath the surface. The two women had known each other since college. They had become fast friends, sharing everything from late-night study sessions to weekend hikes. Over the years, their bond had only grown stronger, and now, as young professionals in the city, their friendship was one of the few constants they could count on. "Can you believe how crazy this week has been?" Lena asked, taking a sip of her coffee. She leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the bustling city streets. "I swear, every project feels like it's due yesterday. I'm just ready to shut my brain off for a bit." Mia chuckled softly, the corners of her lips curling up into a knowing smile. "Tell me about it." "I feel like I'm running on caffeine and stress at this point. Every time I think I've caught up, something else pops up." They both laughed, the kind of laugh that came from years of shared understanding. "So," Lena continued, her tone shifting to a lighter one, "what's the latest with your project?" "You still crushing those numbers?" Mia smiled, her eyes lighting up as she launched into an anecdote about a recent breakthrough at work. Her job required a certain level of analytical thinking, and she took great pride in her ability to solve complex financial problems. As she spoke, Lena listened intently, nodding along, always supportive, always interested in what Mia had to say. The conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from work to family to their plans for the upcoming weekend. They spoke about their parents, their siblings, and the occasional awkward family gathering. They joked about Lena's overbearing aunt, who had once tried to set her up with every eligible bachelor in the city. Mia teased Lena about her reluctance to date anyone, making Lena laugh despite herself. Time seemed to slow as the two women shared stories and laughter, enjoying the simple pleasure of being in each other's company. The cafe, with its comfortable furniture and warm ambience, felt like the perfect place to escape the pressures of their lives, if only for a moment. They didn't need anything more than this: good coffee, good conversation, and the feeling of being understood. But as the minutes passed, the peaceful atmosphere in the cafe began to shift. The door suddenly swung open, causing the bell above it to ring sharply. The sound cut through the stillness like a slap, drawing the attention of every person in the room. Mia's gaze flicked toward the door instinctively, and she saw them before anyone else did. A group of 5 men, all loud and obnoxious, swaggered into the cafe. Their presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, and the quiet chatter that had filled the cafe moments ago immediately stopped. The men were all in their late 30s, dressed in casual clothes, but there was nothing casual about the way they carried themselves. They spoke in loud, brash tones, their laughter echoing off the walls. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from genuine amusement. It was mean, mocking, and filled with an unsettling sense of superiority. Mia's brow furrowed slightly. She could already feel the tension in the air, and she knew this wasn't going to be a good encounter. "Hey, look at this," one of the men, the leader of the group, said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the cafe. He had a shaved head and a Confederate flag tattoo on his forearm, which was clearly visible as he gestured toward the two women. His smirk was predatory, as though he had just spotted an easy target. "Double trouble, huh?" The rest of the group erupted in laughter, the sound harsh and loud. The cafe's atmosphere, which had been warm and inviting moments before, shifted dramatically. Conversation stopped abruptly, and everyone seemed to be watching Mia and Lena, though most of them tried to avoid making eye contact. The waitress, a young woman with a nervous expression, froze behind the counter. Her hand hovered over the coffee pot, unsure of whether to continue her task or retreat into the safety of the back room. It was as if the entire cafe had been held in suspension, waiting to see what would happen next. But Mia and Lena didn't react right away. They exchanged a glance, the kind that only sisters, or in their case, best friends, could share. It was the unspoken communication that had existed between them since they were young. Lena raised an eyebrow, asking without words if they should stand up for themselves. Mia's eyes narrowed just slightly, a silent reminder to remain calm. Lena's lips twitched, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she took another sip of her coffee, her hand steady, betraying none of the unease she felt. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Mia, always the voice of reason, stayed silent, her calm demeanor unshaken. But the leader wasn't done yet. One of his friends, a wiry guy with a patchy beard, stepped closer to their table. He leaned against the edge, looking down at Lena and Mia as though they were insignificant. "What are two girls like you doing here?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" Mia, unfazed, placed her mug down carefully, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She met his gaze with an icy calmness that made it clear she wasn't intimidated. "We're just here to have coffee." "Move along," she said, her tone steady and composed, but the man didn't budge. Behind him, his friends snickered, the sound low and mean. The leader strolled up to their table, a smug grin spreading across his face. He pulled out a chair, spinning it around before dropping into it, his elbows resting on the back of the chair. "You think you can just tell me what to do?" he said, his voice sharp, laced with mockery. "You got a smart mouth for someone who doesn't belong here." The air in the cafe thickened, the tension palpable. Mia's hand subtly shifted toward Lena's wrist, a silent reminder to stay calm. Lena tightened her grip on her coffee cup, her knuckles white, but neither of them flinched. They didn't give the men the satisfaction of seeing them react. For a moment, it felt like the entire cafe was holding its breath. As the door swung open, the familiar chime of the bell above it rang through the cafe, signaling the arrival of a new group of customers. Mia's attention shifted to the entrance, her eyes narrowing instinctively as the 5 men entered the cafe. Their presence was impossible to ignore. The noise they made was immediate, filling the once peaceful space with an unnerving energy. They weren't subtle in their arrival. Each of them spoke loudly, laughing boisterously, the sound of their voices reverberating across the room. They wore their arrogance like a badge of honor, each step they took laced with an air of entitlement. The group, in their mid-30s, had an aggressive swagger, as though they were fully aware that they could control the atmosphere of the cafe just by walking in. Mia could feel the shift in the air immediately. The cafe had been quiet, a sanctuary for people looking to escape the rush of the outside world. But now, it felt as though the peaceful hum of the space had been swallowed by the men's energy. It wasn't the kind of energy that brought life to a room. No, it was an energy that was heavy, oppressive, and hostile. The men didn't even seem to care about the others in the cafe. They were oblivious to the way their loud voices drowned out conversations, ignoring the uncomfortable glances exchanged by other patrons. They were on a mission to make sure everyone knew they had arrived. Mia exchanged a glance with Lena. Both women instinctively knew the group's presence was going to cause trouble, but neither of them said anything right away. They had dealt with difficult people before, people who thought they could make others feel small by raising their voices, by casting their shadows over a room. But something about this group felt different. Their laughter, sharp and jagged, felt like a prelude to something far more sinister. Lena shifted slightly in her chair, trying to focus on the conversation they had been having moments before. She didn't want to let these men derail her evening, but as they walked deeper into the cafe, their voices began to pierce through her thoughts. One of the men, the tallest of the group, a man with a shaved head and a Confederate flag tattoo on his forearm, caught sight of Mia and Lena sitting at their table. His gaze immediately narrowed, his lips curling into a smug grin. "Hey, look at this," he said loudly, his voice thick with mock amusement. The rest of his group turned toward the 2 women, their attention now fixed on Mia and Lena, who sat there trying to remain unaffected. "Double trouble, huh?" The men's laughter rang out in the cafe, loud and cutting. It wasn't a jovial, carefree sound. It was pointed, mocking, and filled with malice. Mia stiffened slightly, her eyes flashing with quiet indignation, but she refused to let them see that they had gotten to her. She took a deep breath and reached for her coffee, setting the mug back on the table with deliberate precision. Lena, who had been looking down at her phone, slowly raised her eyes to meet the group's gaze. Her hand instinctively gripped the edge of her coffee cup, but she stayed silent. The cafe was no longer a safe haven for them. The tension in the air was palpable, every word that was spoken by the men dripping with condescension, each sneer and mocking glance making it harder to pretend everything was okay. One of the men, shorter and stockier than the rest, sauntered over to their table. His eyes locked on Lena first, studying her with a slow, deliberate gaze, taking in the way her white hoodie clung to her slender frame. His smile was wide, but there was nothing friendly about it. "You two don't really belong here, do you?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance and disdain. His voice was laced with a harshness that seemed to carry an undercurrent of threat. "This place is for people who actually appreciate the finer things in life, not, well, people like you." The words hit harder than Mia expected. She had been bracing herself for something, but the bluntness of the insult still caught her off guard. The man was insulting her, insulting Lena, not just for their race but for their very existence in a space he deemed unworthy of them. Mia could feel her pulse quicken, the sting of his words making her want to lash out. She glanced at Lena, whose eyes were still calm, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her discomfort. It was hard to ignore the way the other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not daring to intervene, but clearly aware of the situation unfolding. Lena's grip on her coffee tightened, and her eyes flickered to Mia, silently seeking reassurance. Mia offered her a slight, reassuring nod, her expression cool and composed. They had faced worse in their lives, and the last thing they wanted was to give these men the satisfaction of seeing them react. "We're just here to have coffee," Mia said, her voice steady but firm. She didn't want to escalate things, but she also wasn't going to let this man dictate the terms of the encounter. She met his gaze head-on, her eyes unyielding. The man's smile faltered, replaced by a look of irritation. "Oh, so you think you can just waltz in here like you own the place? It's people like you that ruin the atmosphere." Lena shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't say anything. Mia, however, could feel the tension building in the room, the hostility radiating from the group like heat from an open flame. The other patrons were either avoiding eye contact or pretending not to notice, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to get involved. Mia felt her anger beginning to boil beneath the surface, but she knew better than to let these men provoke her into losing control. "Just leave us alone," Lena finally spoke up, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable firmness that surprised Mia. She glanced at her best friend, her eyes wide in silent appreciation. The stocky man stepped back, looking down at Lena with contempt, but he didn't leave. Instead, he exchanged a quick look with the tall man, the leader of the group. The tall man smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had caused, and nodded. "Yeah, maybe you should leave," the leader added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't seem like you fit in here. Maybe you should stick to your kind." The words were clear and cruel. The cafe, once a haven for peace and quiet, now felt like a battlefield. The offensive nature of the insults hung in the air, and Mia could feel the heat of the moment rising, knowing this wasn't going to end until something had to give. Lena and Mia both knew they had to remain calm, that reacting could make things worse. But every word, every mocking glance was a test of their patience. They could feel the eyes of the other patrons boring into them, waiting to see how they would respond. But Mia and Lena were resolute. They weren't going to back down. In that moment, Mia made a decision. She wasn't going to give these men what they wanted, not an ounce of her energy, not even a flicker of her patience. But she would also never let them think they could get away with this kind of behavior. If they wanted to make trouble, they would get it. The tension in the cafe had become unbearable. What had started as a subtle discomfort had now grown into a full-fledged confrontation. Mia and Lena were doing their best to ignore the men, hoping that if they didn't react, the situation would eventually calm down. But that hope was quickly fading as the men continued to taunt them, pushing their boundaries further and further. The laughter from the group had stopped, replaced by a more dangerous and calculating tone. The men were no longer just throwing insults. They were deliberately trying to provoke the two women, testing just how much they could take before Mia and Lena snapped. And it seemed like they were pushing them harder with each passing moment, as if waiting for the exact moment when they would break. One of the men, a burly figure with tattoos running down his arms, took a step closer to Mia. He grinned wickedly as he eyed her from head to toe. His eyes lingered a moment too long on her leather jacket, then shifted to her face, his smirk growing with every second that passed. "You're looking at me like you want to say something, but I'm guessing you can't. Can't handle a real man, can you?" he mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. Mia held her ground, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else get under her skin. She could feel Lena's eyes on her, a silent exchange between the two of them. Lena's body was tense, but she knew better than to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her fear or frustration. But when the man took another step forward and reached out, his rough hand making contact with her shoulder, that was the moment it all shattered. Mia's body reacted before her mind could even process what was happening. In a flash, her hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist with a vice-like grip. She twisted his arm behind his back, the force of it causing a yelp of surprise to escape from him. His mocking grin vanished as Mia shoved him forward, using his own momentum against him. He crashed into the table with a loud thud, sending the mugs and plates clattering to the floor. The sound of broken porcelain echoed through the cafe, adding to the chaos of the moment. Lena didn't hesitate. She was already on her feet, her adrenaline spiking as she saw Mia take action. She knew they couldn't afford to back down. The fight was now unavoidable. Lena lunged at another man, a wiry individual with a sneering face. He had been standing slightly behind the burly man, but now he was front and center, his fists clenched as he sneered down at the two women. Before he could react, Lena had already grabbed his arm, yanking it down and twisting it in a move that surprised him. She kicked his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground with a grunt of pain. "Stay down!" Lena shouted, her voice fierce, her face set in determination. She could hear the other men getting angry, shouting at them, but she didn't care anymore. This was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about survival, about defending themselves against the constant barrage of insults and provocation. The burly man who had been shoved into the table scrambled to his feet, fury flashing in his eyes. His face had turned red from the shock of being taken down so easily, and he was no longer laughing. Instead, he was seething with rage. His hands balled into fists as he advanced on Mia, growling low in his throat. "You think you can just walk in here and treat us like that?" he snarled, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You're gonna regret that, you little—" Before he could finish his sentence, Mia was already on the move again. She pivoted, moving with the speed and precision of someone who had dealt with this kind of situation before. She kicked out, her boot connecting with his stomach with a satisfying thud, sending him stumbling back. But the fight was far from over. The remaining three men now descended on them, eyes wild with fury. The cafe, once a peaceful retreat, had turned into a battlefield. One of the men attempted to grab Lena by the hair, pulling her back, but she was ready for him. She turned and slammed her elbow into his ribs, causing him to grunt in pain. He released his grip on her, stumbling back in shock. That was enough of an opening for Lena to tackle him, pushing him against a nearby chair. Mia was locked in a battle with the burly man who was now angrier than ever. He threw a punch toward her face, but Mia ducked just in time, his fist slicing through the air above her head. She retaliated with a sharp jab to his ribs, the force of it making him grunt and stagger backward. The cafe was alive with noise now, the sound of punches landing, chairs scraping against the floor, and customers scrambling to get out of the way. A few brave souls had stood up, trying to intervene, but they quickly backed off, clearly not wanting to get involved in the escalating chaos. The remaining two men, seeing their friends being overpowered, hesitated for just a moment. That hesitation was all Mia and Lena needed. Mia took advantage of the lull in the fight to land another punch on the burly man, her knuckles connecting with his jaw. The man staggered back, shaking his head, clearly dazed. Lena was quick to move, taking on the remaining two men with a ferocity that matched Mia's. They underestimated her, thinking she was just the quiet one, the one who would back down. But Lena was determined. She ducked under one of their wild swings, landing a quick knee to his stomach, sending him gasping for air. The other man took a step back, clearly unsure of what to do. His friends were down, and Mia and Lena weren't backing down. They were relentless, pushing back with every ounce of strength they had. But it wasn't enough to stop the madness. The fight had already drawn the attention of everyone in the cafe, and in the distance, Mia could hear the sound of sirens growing louder. It was too late to stop now. The escalation was unavoidable. The fight had reached a point where both sides were exhausted, but the damage had been done. Within minutes, the door to the cafe swung open and uniformed police officers flooded in, their eyes immediately sweeping across the chaotic scene. Mia and Lena had no time to catch their breath before they were grabbed by the officers, their arms twisted behind their backs as they were forced into handcuffs. The men were also taken into custody, their faces flushed with anger and humiliation. The cafe, once a haven of peace, was now a place of chaos, with shattered tables, spilled drinks, and broken glass scattered across the floor. As the officers escorted them out of the cafe, the last thing Mia saw was the shocked faces of the remaining customers, who were still trying to process what had just happened. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. This wasn't over. The fight had just begun. The fight was now in full swing. The once peaceful cafe had transformed into a chaotic battleground, and there was no sign of it slowing down. Mia and Lena, fueled by adrenaline, fought back with everything they had, pushing against the gang of men with a ferocity that matched their aggression. It seemed as though the longer the battle raged, the more intense it became. The air was thick with tension. The sounds of grunts, harsh breaths, and the impact of fists landing on flesh filled the room. The tables and chairs had been pushed aside, creating a makeshift arena where the fight took center stage. A few patrons, who had initially been stunned into silence, were now scrambling to find safety, ducking behind tables and retreating to corners as the fight drew closer to them. Others, realizing the seriousness of the situation, pulled out their phones and began recording, their eyes wide with shock. Mia and Lena, though exhausted, were relentless. Mia's leather jacket had become slightly torn from the struggle, and Lena's white hoodie had dirt smudges from the chaos of the fight. But they didn't care. They kept fighting, moving with purpose as they defended themselves from the men who had relentlessly taunted and provoked them. Every strike, every maneuver was born from self-preservation. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a second. The burly man, still nursing the blow to his jaw from Mia's punch, was now determined to end it. His face was twisted in fury. His eyes narrowed in on Mia as he pushed through the haze of the fight. He threw wild punches, but Mia dodged them with precision, countering with swift jabs. The sounds of their scuffle were drowned out by the increasing commotion around them, chairs toppling over, cups smashing, and the frantic cries of other patrons. Lena, meanwhile, was locked in a fierce struggle with the wiry man who had tried to grab her earlier. Despite the man's initial surprise at being taken down, he was now back on his feet, throwing punches with reckless abandon. His face was flushed, sweat dripping down his forehead as he grappled with Lena. She was agile, using her smaller frame to her advantage, dodging and weaving through his attacks, looking for an opening. The other men, seeing their friends getting overpowered, began to fight back with even greater fury. The cafe was filled with the sounds of shouting, crashing, and the thud of bodies colliding with furniture. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would stop the escalating violence. But just as things were reaching a fever pitch, the blaring sirens of approaching police cars cut through the noise, signaling the arrival of law enforcement. At first, Mia and Lena were too wrapped up in the fight to hear the distant sound of sirens, but soon enough, the screeching of tires and the shouts of officers reached their ears. "Stop!" a voice barked, loud and authoritative, and a few seconds later, the door to the cafe burst open. Uniformed police officers flooded in, their eyes scanning the scene as they took in the disarray, the broken tables, the shattered glass, the chaos that had taken over what had once been a peaceful establishment. Mia and Lena, both panting heavily from the fight, looked up to see several officers charging toward them. Before they could process what was happening, the officers were on them. Hands grabbed their arms, twisting them behind their backs as they were forced to the ground. The men from the gang were also being restrained, and soon, the cafe was a scene of utter disarray. Police officers trying to separate the combatants, patrons standing at a distance, murmuring and pointing their phones in every direction. "Are you serious?" Mia hissed through gritted teeth, trying to resist as the officer tightened his grip on her wrists. She glanced over at Lena, who was also being subdued by another officer. Both girls were caught in a whirlwind of confusion, their minds racing as they tried to make sense of what was happening. They had been defending themselves. Why were they being treated like the aggressors? The officers, though experienced in handling altercations, seemed momentarily unsure of how to proceed. Mia and Lena had been fighting back against a group of men who had been openly insulting and provoking them. Yet the chaos of the moment left little room for clear judgment. The officer's initial assessment was clouded by the noise, the broken glass, and the overwhelming sense of disorder. As they began to process the scene, the gang members, whose faces were red with anger and humiliation, immediately started shouting accusations at Mia and Lena. "They started it." One of the men yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Mia. "They attacked us out of nowhere. We were just minding our own business. I don't know what their problem is." Another man chimed in, his voice frantic. "We didn't do anything." The officers glanced at each other, exchanging uncertain looks. Mia and Lena were still reeling from the fight, trying to catch their breath, but they knew that they couldn't afford to let the men's lies go unchecked. Lena, despite the officer's grip on her, managed to raise her head, her voice shaky but firm. "They started it," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "They've been insulting us, provoking us. We tried to ignore them, but they wouldn't stop." Mia nodded in agreement, her jaw tight as she spoke. "We were just sitting here, minding our business, and they kept making racist remarks. We didn't want any trouble, but they wouldn't leave us alone. We had no choice but to defend ourselves." The officers listened, but their expressions remained neutral. There was no way for them to verify what had happened immediately. The scene was too chaotic, and both sides were making accusations. It wasn't clear who had thrown the first punch, or whether Mia and Lena had been pushed to their limits by the gang's continuous taunts. The officers began separating the two sides, and both Mia and Lena were escorted outside, where they were placed in separate police cars. The gang members were similarly being taken into custody, their faces flushed with anger as they exchanged angry words with the officers. As the police cars pulled away from the cafe, Mia and Lena exchanged a look through the glass of their respective vehicles. They had defended themselves, and yet they were being treated like criminals. The injustice of it all gnawed at them, and the realization hit hard. They had no idea what the consequences would be. The cafe, once a calm and peaceful place, was now left in a state of quiet aftermath. The customers who had witnessed the incident were left to process the chaos they had just witnessed, many of them still shaking from the shock of seeing such a violent altercation unfold in front of them. Some of them had recorded the events on their phones, unsure whether they would be called to testify in court or if their footage would become part of the evidence in the investigation. The police had to sort through the mess, but Mia and Lena knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't let this go. They had been wronged, and they would fight for justice. Mia and Lena sat in the sterile, quiet holding room of the police station, their wrists still sore from the tight handcuffs. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting a dull hum over the space. The events of the previous night felt surreal. How had they gone from being two ordinary women out for coffee to being arrested and thrown into a cold police interrogation room? The weight of the situation was heavy on their shoulders. Mia, typically confident and unflappable, now found herself uncertain, her mind racing. They had done nothing wrong. They were simply defending themselves. But as the minutes stretched on and they waited for the interrogation to begin, doubts crept in. The two girls had been separated as soon as they arrived at the station. Lena had been escorted to one side of the building, while Mia was led to a different room. They hadn't exchanged a word since they had been put into the police cars, both of them silently stewing in the unfairness of the situation. The sound of a door opening broke the silence, and a tall officer stepped in. He had a stern expression, but his eyes seemed tired, like he had been dealing with too many similar cases in the last few hours. "Mia, Lena," he trailed off, glancing at his clipboard. "We need to get this over with quickly. There's a lot going on, and the quicker you cooperate, the sooner we can figure out where we stand." Mia nodded curtly, her jaw tightening. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that she had to stay strong. The officer began to ask questions: what had led to the altercation, who had started the fight, and why they had fought back. Mia explained everything in detail, recounting the insults hurled at them by the gang, the racial slurs, the taunts, and the increasingly aggressive behavior that had escalated into the physical altercation. She told him how they had tried to avoid conflict and only fought back in self-defense. When it was Lena's turn to be questioned, she told the same story. She spoke about how the men had made them feel unsafe and uncomfortable, how their words had cut deeper than just simple insults. She made it clear that they had not sought out the fight, it was forced upon them. Despite their honest and clear explanations, the officer seemed skeptical. He didn't outright accuse them, but he asked probing questions as if trying to find a flaw in their story. Mia's frustration mounted as the questions seemed more focused on justifying the police's actions rather than understanding what had really happened. Meanwhile, the gang members were being questioned too, though they were treated with more leniency. They were being held in separate rooms away from Mia and Lena, but their interrogations seemed far less intense. Mia and Lena couldn't help but feel the disparity. The police officers weren't pushing the men nearly as hard. Instead, the men were repeating their claims of being the victims, of having done nothing to provoke the fight, of having been attacked without cause. They had painted themselves as innocent bystanders in the whole ordeal, blaming everything on Mia and Lena. Mia and Lena knew the truth, but the system didn't seem to be on their side, not yet. As the hours ticked by, Mia grew increasingly restless. Her phone was still in her purse, sitting outside out of reach. She had no way of knowing if anyone had seen the video footage from the cafe, or if it had made its way into the hands of the media. That was their only hope: a video showing the full extent of the provocation, the racist behavior, and the reason they had been forced to fight back. But Mia had to wait. They both had to wait. Then, finally, there was a breakthrough. A uniformed officer rushed into the room, his face a little more relaxed than before. He had a stack of paperwork in his hands, and his eyes seemed to hold a glimmer of something approaching relief. "The video footage has surfaced," he said, barely containing the excitement in his voice. "It's all over the news. The witnesses who were in the cafe, they've spoken up, and the video of what happened is making its rounds. We've seen it. It shows everything, your side of the story. The truth is clear now." Mia let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The tension in her body loosened slightly, but the weight of the situation still hung heavy in the air. "Does this mean the charges are going to be dropped?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly from both relief and the exhaustion of the ordeal. "Not only are the charges against you being dropped," the officer confirmed, "but we're also moving forward with charges against the gang members. Assault, hate crimes, public disturbance. The list goes on. They've been arrested and they'll face consequences for their actions." Mia couldn't help but smile, a tired but triumphant smile. Lena, who had been waiting for the same news, met her eyes across the room, and a sense of mutual understanding passed between them. It wasn't just about their own freedom. It was about standing up for what was right, for fighting against the racism they had endured. As the officers began to process the paperwork to release them, the media began to gather outside the police station. Journalists had caught wind of the story, and now, with the evidence of the video, they were eager to cover the aftermath. Mia and Lena, still shaken but emboldened, stepped out into the daylight, their eyes squinting as they were met with cameras and microphones thrust toward them. The reporters asked the same questions, eager to hear their side of the story. In the face of it all, Mia and Lena stood tall. They told their truth, speaking about the provocation, the unfairness of the system, and how they had been forced to fight back in order to protect themselves. As the media frenzy continued, the public began to rally behind them. People took to social media, praising Mia and Lena for their bravery and for standing up against racism and violence. Support poured in from all corners, from allies, from strangers, from people who had experienced similar forms of discrimination. But despite the support and the public's outcry against the gang's behavior, Mia and Lena remained grounded. They had faced adversity head-on, and though the road to justice hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. The support from the public, the apology from the police, and the charges brought against the gang members were a bittersweet victory. They had fought not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been wronged. "I'm proud of us," Lena said softly, her voice filled with emotion as they sat together on the steps outside the cafe. The calm of the evening, with the lingering smell of coffee and the soft rustling of the wind, felt surreal after everything they had been through. "Me too," Mia replied, her voice steady. "We didn't back down, and now they can't silence us." Together they watched as the sun dipped behind the buildings, the sky painting shades of purple and orange. Justice had been served.